Really influential for bodies like AAOIFI, that's the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutions. So let's start at the beginning. When we say combining contracts here, what exactly are we talking about?
Right. So at its core, it means you have a single process, maybe between two or more people or entities, that involves, well, two or more separate, distinct contracts. The standard actually breaks this down into different let's call them states or scenarios. For example, you might have combined contracts where none of them are conditional on each other. And importantly, there's no prior sort of implicit understanding. The term in Arabic is mu'ata. That's probably the simplest form.
Okay, so just linked together, but no real dependency or prior handshake deal, so to speak. What else?
Well, then you have situations where one contract is conditional on another finishing, but still there's no prior mu'ata, no pre-agreement. Or, flipping that, you could have contracts combined with a prior mu'ata. That understanding exists beforehand, but maybe the contracts themselves aren't explicitly conditional on each other in the document. And there's a really interesting one where parties might sort of alternate between two different potential contracts covering the same thing without actually deciding which one it is during the contracting session itself. It shows a certain flexibility.
That is interesting. Okay, so those are the sort of theoretical states. How does this look in practice? Like, what are the actual shapes these combined contracts take in a real transaction?
Practically speaking, you often see multiple contracts being fulfilled for just one single payment, one compensatory value. Think of it like a package deal, perhaps.
Okay.
Then there are cases where you have combined contracts, but they have two separate compensatory values. So distinct payments for distinct parts of the overall deal. A very common form is where some contracts are explicitly made conditional on others. You know, contract B only happens if contract A is completed. It creates a sequence.
The chain reaction almost.
Exactly. And that leads to the last form, which covers many modern products, what's called a sequential contractual system. It's designed with progressive parts and stages, one naturally leading into the next. Now, when we talk about the basic Shari'ah ruling on all this, generally it's permissible. You can combine more than one contract into a single system.
So the default is yes, it's allowed. Does that mean the main thing to check is just whether each individual contract on its own would be permissible? Like the building blocks have to be sound.
That's exactly right. The permissibility of the whole structure really depends on the permissibility of each individual part, even when they're combined. But there's a really important unless, and this shows the precision of Islamic law. If there's a specific Sharia text or clear evidence that prohibits a particular combination, maybe because of what it leads to, then that specific combination is not allowed, regardless of the general rule. It's not just a free-for-all.
Got it. So general permission, but with specific important exceptions based on religious texts or evidence. That takes us neatly into the guardrails, the specific controls that determine if a combination is actually okay. This is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yes, absolutely. These controls are critical. First, there must be no explicit Sharia prohibition against that specific combination. The standard gives a classic example. You cannot combine a sale with a loan. That's called baywa salaf.
Why is that prohibited?
Well, the concern is that it could be a way to hide interest. The loan part could be tied to the sale in a way that generates an unfair, unearned increase, which is forbidden. It's about blocking indirect routes to riba, or usury.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. Preventing anything that even looks like interest. What's the next guardrail?
The second one is that the combination must not be a usurious ruse, what's known as hila ribawaya. It shouldn't be a clever trick or, a loophole designed just to get around Sharia rules. A common example cited is the inna sale. This is a specific type of buyback arrangement. On the surface, it looks like two sales, but its structure and intent can effectively disguise a loan with interest.
So it's about substance over form, looking at the real purpose.
Exactly. Sharia looks at the intent and the actual effect, not just the label you put on it.
Okay, so no explicit prohibition and no clever tricks. What if it's not a direct trick, but it still might lead to something forbidden?
That brings us to the third control. The combination must not be a means or dardia to usury. Even if it's not designed as a direct ruse, it shouldn't be something that consistently or strongly opens the door to forbidden practices like riba. For example, combining a loan, qurdi, with a compensatory contract, muwada, like a sale or lease, could, in some situations, indirectly facilitate interest. This kind of combination is prohibited if it tends to lead to the forbidden, and there's a strong suspicion that's the intention.
Unless.
Unless there's a genuine, demonstrable necessity or a really strong overriding interest that makes it acceptable in that specific case. But the bar is high. It's about preventing harm and closing pathways to unethical outcomes.
Right, focusing on potential negative consequences. What's the final main control?
The last one is that the contracts being combined must not contradict each other or conflict in their basic legal effects and obligations. Think about it. You couldn't, say, combine a contract where you gift someone an item, hewada, with another contract in the same transaction where you immediately sell that same item back to the person you just gifted it to.
Yeah, that sounds inherently confusing, contradictory.
Exactly. It creates a logical impossibility regarding ownership and intent. So such combinations are forbidden because they undermine the clarity and consistency that contracts require.
Okay, so we have these clear boundaries, these controls. But Islamic law is also known for having flexibility, right? Things like rukhs, which are licenses or permissions, and takfifat, concessions. Does that apply here when contracts are combined?
Yes, it does. And this is a really important aspect. The basic principle is this. Something that might not be acceptable or might be strictly scrutinized if a contract stands completely on its own can sometimes be overlooked if it's considered an implicit or subsidiary part of a larger combined transaction.
Implicit or subsidiary. What does that mean in practical terms? How do you define that?
It generally means something that naturally comes within the main deal, or is secondary to the main purpose, or maybe follows logically from it. It's not the core element. Usually, whether something qualifies as subsidiary is determined by established custom or urf. And crucially, it needs the okay from the institution's Shari'ah supervisory board. They ensure this flexibility is applied properly within Shari'ah bounds.
Okay, so custom and expert oversight are key. Can you give some examples? What sort of things might be overlooked in these combined scenarios?
Sure. For instance, a minor amount of gharar that's significant uncertainty or risk might be tolerated in a compensatory contract if that uncertainty is really secondary to the main point of the deal.
So a little bit of fuzziness is okay if it's not about the main thing?
In certain contexts, yes, if it's minor and subsidiary. Similarly, minor jahala, which is significant ignorance or ambiguity about the specific item being contracted upon, can sometimes be overlooked in compensatory contracts if it's, again, a subsidiary element. Another interesting one involves sarf, or currency exchange. Normally, sarf requires immediate, on-the-spot exchange. But if sarf is combined with, say, hawala, remittance, as a subsidiary part of the process, the strict requirement for spot exchange might be relaxed. It acknowledges the realities of international money transfer.
Wow, okay. So the strict timing rule for currency exchange can bend a little when it's just a facilitating part of a bigger transaction. That seems very practical.
It is, and it extends further. Even bay al-kali bil-kali, the sale of debt for debt, which is generally forbidden because it involves exchanging two deferred payments, might be overlooked if it occurs only in a minor subsidiary way within a larger, valid transaction.
So things normally off limits can become acceptable if they're just small, necessary side aspects?
In specific, approved circumstances, yes. And one more. Even the formal offer and acceptance, ijab or qabul, might be overlooked in what's considered an implicit sale, if there's a genuine need or a strong prevailing interest that justifies it. It shows a certain pragmatism built into the system.
This is fascinating. It leads us to another really key concept you mentioned earlier, mu'ata, that implicit understanding or pre-agreement. Can we unpack that a bit more? Sounds foundational to how these combined contracts often work.
Absolutely. Mu'ata is essentially that hidden or tacit agreement between the parties before the formal contracts are signed. It's the meeting of minds, the understanding reached in preliminary discussions about the series of transactions they intend to carry out.
So it's like the blueprint agreed upon beforehand.
Precisely. It sets the stage. And its characteristics are important. First, it is an agreement to execute specific contracts and promises down the line. Second, if it's explicitly mentioned or clearly implied as part of the main contract, it actually functions legally like a precondition to that contract. And this is crucial. Sharia gives it the same binding force as other preconditions stipulated within contracts. So this prior understanding isn't just informal, it can be legally significant. Its validity is judged much like any condition made at the time of the contract itself.
Wow. So that preliminary agreement carries real weight. That means the nature of that mu'ata, what was actually agreed upon implicitly, must be really important for whether the whole thing is permissible or not.
Exactly right. The intent behind the mu'ata is critical. The standard identifies different types, which helps determine permissibility. First, there's mu'ata on usurious stratagems. For example, implicitly agreeing beforehand to structure an INA sale, the problematic buyback. This type of mu'ata is strictly forbidden by Sharia, and it invalidates the subsequent contracts because its whole purpose is to achieve something prohibited.
Okay, so if the prior understanding is designed to cheat the system, it's a non-starter. What other types are there?
Then you have mu'ata on usurious means. This is where the parties agree implicitly to combine things in a way that could lead to usury, like combining a loan with a sale in a specific manner. This is also forbidden if that combination habitually leads to the forbidden outcome, and there's a strong suspicion that's the intent.
So if it's a known pathway to riba.
Yes, unless, again, there's a genuine necessity or a compelling Sharia-recognized interest that justifies it in that specific instance. But generally, it's prohibited as it facilitates the forbidden.
Okay. Are there permissible types of mu'ata?
Yes, absolutely. There's mu'ata on Sharia-compliant solutions. These are actually seen as praiseworthy stratagems or arrangements. Here, the means used, the combination of contracts, don't violate any Sharia rules, and the overall goal aligns with Sharia objectives, like facilitating trade or investment ethically without causing harm. This type is perfectly permissible and often necessary for innovative product structures.
So using that prior understanding to structure something beneficial and compliant is actually encouraged.
Correct. And finally, there's mu'ata on combining contradictory contracts, using a prior understanding to knowingly set up contracts that inherently clash in their legal effects, like the gift and sellback example earlier. This is also forbidden and invalid because the resulting structure is fundamentally flawed and contradictory.
It's really striking how these quite detailed legal concepts apply so directly to finance today. How are these combined contracts and the idea of mu'ata actually used in contemporary Islamic banking and finance?
They're fundamental to many modern products. We see them constantly in sophisticated contractual systems involving a whole series of contracts and promises. And often, these are agreed upon beforehand through mu'ata to be executed in a very specific order or sequence.
Could you give us some concrete examples of products that rely on this?
Sure. Think about murabaha for a purchase order that's the common cost-plus financing. The bank buys an asset based on the customer's promise to buy it from them, then sells it at a markup. That involves a promise, a purchase, and a sale, multiple steps often pre-agreed.
Okay, that's a very common one.
Right. Or ijara muntahia bidamlik, leasing, that ends with ownership transferring to the lessee. That typically involves a lease contract plus a promise or option to transfer ownership at the end, all agreed upfront. And also musharaka mutanakisa, or diminishing partnership, used often in home finance. It involves a partnership agreement, lease payments, and gradual unit purchases. Again, a sequential system planned out in advance.
So these complex multi-stage products really depend on this framework of combining permissible contracts, often with that prior understanding, the mu'ata. What are the overall legal takeaways for these systems?
Yes.
There are several key rulings. First, if that mu'ata, the prior understanding, is explicitly referenced or integrated into the contract, it becomes legally binding and obligatory on both parties. They have to follow through. Second, any specific promises made within these systems, like a promise to buy or sell later, are generally considered binding on the party who made the promise. This gives security to the arrangement. Third, the whole system, its formation, the rules governing it, the requirements and conditions, is subject to the general Sharia rules for contracts. They are considered valid and binding structures, not just loose collections of agreements.
So the entire sequence is treated as a legitimate, enforceable contractual arrangement.
Precisely. But, and this is vital, all those Sharia controls we talked about earlier, no explicit prohibition, no ruse, no means to usury, no contradiction, they all must be observed within these complex systems too.
The guardrails still apply to the whole structure.
Absolutely. On the flip side, applying those Sharia concessions and relaxations we discussed for minor gharar or jahala, for example, is permissible within these systems if the issue arises specifically because of the combination itself and it's genuinely subsidiary. And finally, if one party doesn't fulfill their obligations within this agreed system, the other party who suffers harm has the right to seek compensation for the actual damages they incurred. There's recourse for breaches.
This has been incredibly illuminating. We've gone from the basic definition of combining contracts through the different ways they manifest, the really crucial guardrails that keep them Sharia compliant, the fascinating concept of mu'ata or prior understanding, and even the flexibility Sharia allows through concessions. It really paints a picture of Islamic finance not as just a set of rigid, isolated rules, but as a sophisticated system that can adapt and combine agreements, sometimes in quite complex ways, but always within a clear ethical and legal framework.
That's a great summary. This nuanced approach really does allow for flexibility and, frankly, innovation in finance, enabling products that meet modern needs while strictly adhering to the ethical foundations of Sharia. It's all about ensuring fairness, clarity, and trust, even when the arrangements get complicated.
Absolutely. And maybe for you, listening to this, it sparks a thought. How does understanding these detailed rules about combining contracts, these checks and balances within Islamic finance, maybe offer a different lens on modern financial engineering more broadly?
Huh.
What does it tell you about finding that balance between creating complex financial solutions and sticking to core ethical boundaries, whatever your background? Something to think about.